And again, in absentia, thank you to our Ukrainian speakers. So during the course of today, we are going to look at this watershed moment from many different angles. And we are going to look at the question of power and that reckoning with power from many different perspectives. And the first perspective we're going to take is we're going to look at the power of freedom. And I'm delighted to welcome on stage Elizabeth Kuiper, EPC Associate Director, and I'll let her introduce her speaker for the first of our conversations today. Liz, over to you.
So much.
Should work. You just,
yeah, should work. Thank you so much, Jackie, and good morning, all of you. Welcome to this conversation with Professor Lea Ipi about the power of freedom. Professor Ipi, I hope that you can see and hear as well.
Try again.
Can you all hear me? Hi.
Yes, hi, good morning. It's really good seeing you. And again, thanks so much for taking the time about this conversation about the power of freedom. And just perhaps to briefly introduce you to the audience here today, Professor Ipi comes from Albania and she teaches at the London School of Economics. She also has written a book, in case you haven't seen it yet, which is called Free, Coming of Age at the End of History. And the book, if you haven't read it yet, is really a must read. It's translated already in 19 languages. It got a lot of prizes already. And it's a memoir about growing up in Albania amid the fall of communism. And in many ways, it's also a universal story about how communist societies experienced the transition to liberalism and capitalism. So, Professor Ipi, again, many thanks for being with us. And I guess my first question is, you left Albania at the collapse of socialism at the end of the 80s, the late 90s. And then you became a professor at the London School of Economics. And you're now teaching there. And you paint in your book the attraction of the Western power of Albania and the desire for liberalism, for capitalism. Albania, really clear, you state in your book, abandoned communism in search of freedom. So for those of you that haven't read the book, can you tell us more about, has this strategy actually delivered freedom? And what is freedom? Is it political? Is it more personal? Is it private?
Thank you. Yes, so the book tries to open a conversation around what freedom is, and it tries to explore this question from the perspective of different characters who have different interpretations about freedom and different perspectives on it. And the main character is a child, and so the child is the one that in some ways mediates between these different perspectives. I would say that the way the book tries to capture is to talk about different ideas of freedom, to talk about a kind of negative idea of freedom, that is the freedom to be free from the state, from interference, and from authorities that, as they did in communist Albania, tell you what to do, where to go, what to say, what to wear. And then to talk about a different kind of freedom that was absent in the post-90 period, which was a more robust conception of freedom as a freedom to develop. And what the book tries to talk about is in some ways the fact that the freedom was presented to us as both an ideal, but also as a disillusionment. It was what everyone in Eastern Europe was striving towards at the end of communism, but it was also what they saw with disappointment when they reflected on the kinds of changes that were brought to Albania, where a certain kind of freedom, so first generation political freedom, was prioritized, but the cost of that freedom was shock therapy and neoliberal reforms, which didn't really deliver on social freedoms. And so the book really tries to engage in this conversation between different characters and to talk about the fact that liberalism and capitalism doesn't necessarily mean freedom, or it means a very particular account of freedom, which is not a full conception of human development and human flourishing.
I would like to touch on the subtitle of the book, which is Coming of Age at the End of History, because my own perspective is very different. I grew up in Western Europe, but I remember when I studied, we passionately discussed Fukuyama and to what extent he was right about the flaws of capitalism and the model he presented in his book. And I think it's for a reason as well that he wrote recently sort of an explanation of what he meant to say back in the days. And I guess my question is, not only communism failed to promise freedom, and also fail to realize it. So again, if you link freedom to coming to age and the end of history. What are the contradictions of the current Western model, especially if you think about it in the current geopolitical context?
I think so the title of the book is ironic. It talks about the end of history, but exactly with this idea that in fact this was not the end of history. And I think now it's clear to everyone that it wasn't the end of history in terms of seeing the struggle for ideological appropriation of the concept of freedom. What it also tries to talk about is to try and distinguish between the philosophical idea and the moral idea of freedom on the one hand, and freedom as ideology in the other, and to try and articulate a more critical account that tries to distinguish between these two perspectives, and to say that what we are told and sold as freedom in particular societies is not necessarily overlapping with this kind of moral idea of freedom. For me, the biggest failure of the liberal capitalist model, as I see it, is the asymmetries of power that shape the world in which we live, that are asymmetries of power both within states, so between rich and poor people within particular nation states, but also between states, states who are at the heart of Europe or the world or the kind of core Western system and that makes the rules, and other states that are still in a position of passive recipients of these rules and have very little agency in how these rules of the international system are made. And for me, that is problematic, because if we think about the ideal of democracy and what democracy means, it means that everyone makes the rules that they are subjected to, that we all have agency. And democracy is connected to freedom precisely because we make the rules that we're subjected to. That is to say, we accept to be coerced, but because we also consider ourselves to be equal authors of the law. And in a world that is shaped by these power asymmetries, that equal authorship collapses, and you see that some voices count a lot more, some lives are a lot more worthy of being lived, and that power asymmetry that has different articulations, whether it's ethnic or national, or whether it's class-based, or whether it's cultural, or whether it's just a power of voice, all of these power asymmetries make it very difficult to say that the liberal societies that we have are actually really realizing freedom. And that's the kind of critical perspective that the book tries to articulate at the very end.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the final pages of the book, you describe liberalism, and I'm quoting you here, as broken promises, the destruction of solidarity, the right to inherit privilege, turning a blind eye to injustice. So I guess, why is Albania following that same track? And again, I get the irony from the subtitle, but why are we all seeming to do the same in Europe?
Well, I mean, I think it's not that, I don't think Albania really has a choice, because Albania is a very small country, and like all countries of that kind in Europe, they have always been living at the margins of the system. Their history has always been shaped by the history of powerful nations and powerful countries. I think the reason, the way I see the very basic failure is the relationship between economic power and political power. They're economic agents that have particular interests that get promoted and pursued and aggressively realized, and they come at the expense of other interests of development and society. We saw that very clearly with the recent COVID crisis, where, you know, when you thought about the cost of that crisis and who was working and who was absorbing the cost of the crisis, it was very clear that there was an asymmetric distribution of burdens, even where there was an equal contribution and equal cooperation in society. So I think we're in the wrong political economic paradigm, and until both citizens and political elites wake up to that reality and try and think about developing a different model, which has to be both, as I say, promoted at the national level, but most importantly, and that's where the EU comes in, at the transnational level, because it can only be done if there is coordination between nation states, that will remain the case, unfortunately.
And of course, in the current geopolitical context, it's almost inevitable to speak about the Russian invasion in Ukraine and also the geopolitical impact on that. In a recent interview with The Guardian, you compared Russia to Albania, and especially when it came to the isolation of the country. So you said the more isolated it became, and then you speak about Albania, the more paranoid its political elites grew, the tighter their grip became on those who dared to disagree. Where does the world, or should the world, go from here in terms of political organization, the political order?
I think what I was writing about and what I still believe is the importance of understanding when we engage with what we call non-liberal societies, to understand that even in societies that we see as illiberal and authoritarian, there are margins of agency within those societies, and there are criticisms within those society that people need to understand from the outside before they engage with perspectives of, what can we do for them? How can we save them? How can we liberate them? And one of the things that I was lamenting when I was writing about Albania during communism was that Albania was from the outside always seen as the kind of quintessential paradigmatic case of the isolated society. And the world didn't actually know a whole lot about it because it was so isolated. But people from within, from Albania, knew a lot more about the world than the world knew about them. So paradoxically, because there was no freedom of speech, there was more desire to access perspectives different from one's own. And so I think I was trying to warn against a certain complacency that there is in liberal societies about the fact that people take for granted freedom, and freedom as granted by, as given by institutions. And with that freedom then approach realities that don't have that. And they approach it with a certain paternalism, which I don't think is then particularly helpful when it comes to engage in delivering solutions, or in even thinking about how to deliver these solutions. So I think for me, the model is one where one tries to understand better what goes on the ground. And one of the failures, in fact, of the transition in Eastern Europe is, I think, exactly the fact that it was done in a way that didn't quite engage with internal perspectives, that was very much top down.
My last question, because again, I think we could go on about this for a very long time, but my last question is really linking your personal history, where also your family suffered a lot under communism. And then you becoming a professor in political theory and also teaching Marxism today, which I think is a fascinating turn. So how do we need to go about alternative systems? Is it possible to come up with an alternative system? How do you see that also from your professional perspective, linking that to your private experiences during communism?
Well, I think alternative systems in a way are a necessity that is driven by the circumstances and by the crisis that we always overcome. History is made of development, is made of flux, is made of crisis, is made of conflict. And the question is, what do humans do to understand that conflict and to develop their perspectives in a way that builds on the lessons of the past, that tries to learn from the past and engages with it in the right way? So the reason I went back and appropriated the kind of tradition that is critical of capitalism, which I didn't see necessarily as being the same as the state socialism that people experienced in Albania, is that I don't think it's helpful to approach history in this kind of black and white way where we try to pass moral judgments about the past. What we can do with the past is to try and understand it and engage with it and see how we can reflect on it in a way that is productive for the challenges of the future. And then what alternatives there are and what systems there are, I think that's not something that any one particular intellectual or institution can really say. That has to be the result of a democratic process that is open and as inclusive as possible.
Thank you so much, Professor Ipi. I think your remarks about freedom and linking that to also power and its different forms it's very important, and also I think will guide us today through the different conversations that we're going to have about indeed the power of freedom, the power of democracies. So thank you so much for being with us this morning, and we hope to stay in touch and see you at different occasions at the European Policy Center. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you very much also to you, Liz, for driving such a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Leah. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take a break. Coffee is served outside. We will resume at 11 o'clock when we're going to look at global trends that are shaping power in the 21st century. How is power seen, viewed in different regions of the world? And what are the trends that are shaping that thinking? Lots more to come throughout the day. Enjoy the coffee, and I will see you back here at 11 o'clock. Thank you.